Welcome to the debate. Today we are walking the razor's edge between, well, clinical medicine and metaphysical philosophy. We're analyzing Robert Walker's novel, The Space Between.
Right, and frankly, calling it a novel almost feels like a categorization error. I mean, yes, it is fiction, but Walker structures the entire narrative around a very real and, very contentious body of research regarding near-death experiences, or NDEs. He takes 5 characters, kills them, clinically speaking, of course, and then demands we grapple with the data they bring back.
And that right there is the core tension we need to unpack today. Walker poses a question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Is the space between cardiac arrest and resuscitation just a biological hallucination produced by a dying brain? Or is it a navigable territory that exists entirely independently of the body? I'll be arguing that the experiences depicted in the book, specifically the acquisition of verifiable data during brain death, point to consciousness existing outside the biological monitor.
And I will be taking the other side. I argue that the space between is a product of the brain's final chaotic firing. Cortical disinhibition. The characters' transformations are profound, sure, but they are responses to cognitive trauma rather than some sort of metaphysical travel. It's the battle between the monitor and the field, as the book puts it.
Exactly. You have the medical chart, the monitor, which flatlines, and then the subjective experience, the field. And I think Walker gives us the perfect test case right out of the gate with his protagonist, Michael Reeves. He is an aerospace engineer. His whole worldview is built on thermodynamics and signal processing. He is a materialist in the truest sense.
Yeah, the kind of guy who thinks the soul is just a poetic word for software, up until he fails a stress test, goes into ventricular fibrillation, and is dead for 11 minutes.
11 minutes of asystole. So, for our listeners who aren't medical professionals, that means a flatline. No heartbeat, and crucially, a flat EEG. No electrical activity in the cortex. And yet Michael returns with data. And I want to emphasize that word, data. He describes standing in a field with a woman named Margaret Alderson, detailing the specific blue flowers on her dress. He claims she's his wife's grandmother, a woman he never met who died decades before he even knew his wife.
It is a very compelling narrative hook, I'll grant you that. It definitely grabs the reader.
But it's more than a hook, right? Because he brings back the location of a specific photograph of her in that dress, sitting in a sealed box in a basement in Decatur, Illinois, a box he has never seen. This is the veridical perception argument. How does a brain with zero electrical activity access information about a photograph 3 states away?
Well, zero electrical activity is a tricky phrase. The scalp electrodes used in an EEG, they measure the surface of the brain. They don't necessarily capture deep brain structures. And the book actually addresses this directly. It references the AWARE-2 study and the concept of the metabolic flare.
Ah, you mean the gamma wave surge?
Exactly. When the brain is starved of oxygen, anoxia, we know there can be a sudden, massive surge of highly organized electrical activity. Think of it like a computer's final dump of information before the battery dies. It removes all the inhibitory brakes. In that state, the brain constructs a simulation that feels realer than real because the usual filters are gone.
Okay, but a simulation requires inputs. A metabolic flare might explain a bright light, or a feeling of euphoria, or even a hallucination based on a description he heard once and forgot. But does a metabolic flare explain the acquisition of new external data? The photographed indicator is external.
But is it external? Or is it a case where the narrative, and the human mind generally, reconstructs memory to fit a pattern? Michael is an engineer. He craves systems. His brain, in that final trauma, constructs a system to survive the experience. He might have seen a similar photo years ago, or his wife might have mentioned the dress in passing. The veridical details are just the mind projecting order onto the void. It's a survival mechanism, not a ghost.
That feels like a massive stretch to me. You're asking the brain to be incredibly creative while it's literally shutting down from lack of fuel. But okay, if you want to talk about the brain constructing reality, we have to talk about Sarah Okonkwo.
Ah, the blind experiencer. This is a genuinely fascinating case study.
Right. Sarah was born with bilateral optic nerve aplasia. In plain English, she has no optic nerves. The wiring from the eye to the brain just isn't there. And she has no functional visual cortex. She has never seen light, shadow, or shape. Yet, during her 7-minute cardiac arrest on Roosevelt Boulevard, she reports visual perception. She sees rain on the windshield.
Lines of silver falling through gray. It's beautiful prose, I'll give Walker that.
It is. But think about the implications. She doesn't have the vocabulary for silver. She even describes a scar on the paramedic's eyebrow. Dr. Adeyemi, the researcher in the book, points out that if this were just the brain misfiring, it should produce auditory hallucinations. Her brain is wired for sound. Why would a dying brain produce a complex hallucination in a sense it has never possessed?
I will admit that is the strongest argument for your side. But have you considered cross-modal plasticity?
Go ahead and break that down for us.
So, in the blind, the visual cortex doesn't just sit there and atrophy. It gets repurposed. It starts processing sound and touch. Now, in the extreme stress of death, during that metabolic flare we talked about, who's to say the brain doesn't fire those repurposed neurons in a massive, uncoordinated burst?
You're saying she's hearing the rain so loudly it feels like sight.
Essentially, yes. She felt the rain, she heard the rain, and her mind synthesized those inputs into a spatial map that she, lacking any other vocabulary, interpreted as seeing. Look at how she describes it afterward. She calls this new sight a wound. She says it was a channel that opened and closed, and now she can't paint anymore because her internal reference point is broken. That sounds like neurological alteration, perhaps even damage. Like a phantom limb sensation for an entire sense.
See, phantom limb implies the memory of a limb. She had no memory of sight to draw from. And describing the scar on the paramedic, a physical reality confirmed by other characters, requires input. If her eyes didn't provide it and her brain couldn't construct it from memory, where did it come from? It suggests a channel of perception entirely independent of the biological architecture.
Or it suggests our understanding of how the brain constructs spatial awareness is still in the dark ages. We assume sight requires eyes. Maybe spatial awareness under duress uses a different pathway. We need to stay in the gap between the monitor and the experience without jumping straight to the supernatural conclusion.
Well, let's shift gears to the theological implications then, because this is where the wish fulfillment hypothesis, the idea that the brain just gives us what we want to see to comfort us, really starts to crumble. We need to look at James Whitfield.
The Southern Baptist pastor?
Yes, a man who preached a very strict, exclusionary theology for 27 years. Salvation through Christ alone, the narrow gate, everyone else is out. He dies for 9 minutes. Now, if his brain is projecting expectation to comfort him, he should see the heaven he preached. He should see the golden gates.
And instead,
he encounters a light containing the exact people he preached against: a Hindu woman, a Muslim child, a gay man named Danny Gwen. And the crushing part for him is they aren't there as converts. They are just home. This experience destroys his theology and his career. He has to resign. Why would a dying brain, seeking comfort, generate a hallucination that dismantles the subject's entire identity?
I don't see that as a contradiction. I see it as a resolution of cognitive dissonance. Deep down, James carried the burden of his exclusionary preaching. The book implies he carried a wound from the weight of judging others.
So you think his subconscious was just trying to free him?
Exactly. The surprise factor doesn't prove an external reality. It proves James was conflicted. His subconscious used the trauma of death to resolve that conflict, to break the theology that was suffocating him. Compare him to Fatima Khalil at Johns Hopkins.
Right. She sees the woman of light.
Right. And for her, that figure expands her Islamic faith. It connects it to the concept of barzakh, the barrier between the living and the dead. It doesn't break her. Both James and Fatima see things that interact with their specific psychological needs. James needed his rigidity broken. Fatima needed her faith expanded. That points to these experiences being subjective, constructed from the individual's mind.
It's a valid reading, but James explicitly describes the experience as the difference between the map and the territory. His doctrine was the map, but the light was the territory. And the fact that the experience was consistent across these different people, that the light had the same quality of unconditional completeness, suggests they are visiting the same place, even if they interpret it differently.
But they don't all visit the same place. And this is the biggest hurdle for your navigable territory theory. We have to talk about Danny Reeves.
Michael's son, the combat veteran.
Danny does not see a light. He does not see a field. He goes to the void.
Right, which researchers classify as a type 2 distressing NDE.
It's terrifying. He experiences absolute nihilism. He is told specifically that he never existed, that his life was a fabrication. If NDEs prove a benevolent afterlife, why does Danny experience a void that negates his existence?
Because the territory isn't just one room. The research, Grayson and Bush's work cited in the book, shows distressing NDEs are a recognized part of the phenomenon. They just get underreported because they're traumatizing and shameful for the survivor.
Or it fits the VA's diagnosis in the book: dissociative episodes secondary to TBI. Danny is a soldier. He has seen the horrors of Mosul. The void is simply his brain failing to construct a self during the trauma of his injury. It reflects his internal state, his nihilism born of war, not an external truth.
I have to disagree there. And the evidence is in his interaction with Hector, the medic who saves him.
You mean the shared sensation?
Yes. Hector is compressing Danny's chest, and he explicitly states he felt Danny leave at minute 6 and felt him return. This wasn't just Danny's internal hallucination, it was an intersubjective event. 2 people felt it.
Come on, Hector was under extreme combat stress. We look for patterns and meaning. A medic feeling a departure is just a poetic description of a physiological decline, like a drop in perfusion pressure. It's not metaphysical.
But look at the aftermath. Danny spends years wrestling with the void's verdict that he doesn't exist. He eventually realizes it's false, based on what he calls the test of continued reality. The fact that he is still here, that people love him, proves the void lied. But he treats the void as a hostile territory he navigated, not a bad dream he had. The book suggests these distressing experiences are the honest accounts, stripping away comfort to leave the raw prior condition of existence.
Prior condition is just a philosophical interpretation of a neurological shutdown. When the brain's ego center, the default mode network, goes offline, of course it feels like you never existed. The part of the brain generating you stopped firing. Danny experienced the biological mechanics of ceasing to be. That he survived is a miracle of medicine, not metaphysics.
Why does he share the same structural elements as his father, just inverted? Michael sees the presence of everything. Danny sees the absence. They are 2 sides of the same coin, accessing the same fundamental reality, just different polarities of it.
Or they are father and son, sharing genetic predispositions in neurochemistry. That is the much simpler explanation.
Perhaps. But let's move to the piece of evidence that I find the hardest to dismiss, the splinter in the skepticism. We have to talk about Dr. Elena Vasquez and the butterfly tattoo.
The monarch with the blue wingtip?
Right. Set the scene for us.
So, Michael Reeves, the skeptic, is clinically dead on the table. Dr. Vasquez is running the code. She is wearing sterile gloves that come up her wrist. Underneath that glove is a tattoo of a monarch butterfly.
And there is no physical way Michael could have seen it. The glove never came off. Yet when he wakes up, not only does he describe the tattoo, he describes the specific error in it, the blue wingtip that shouldn't be there. This is impossible to explain materialistically. Dr. Vasquez is a woman of science, and she cannot reconcile her training with this fact. It breaks her worldview.
I'll admit, it's the book's most seductive detail.
Seductive? It's the smoking gun.
But notice how the book frames it. It doesn't use the tattoo to prove God. It uses the tattoo to define the gap.
Explain that distinction.
The book isn't arguing that the tattoo proves an afterlife. It claims the tattoo creates a gap between the monitor, the chart saying he was dead, and the field, his experience. I argue that the tattoo represents the limit of our current observation. Just because we can't explain how he saw it doesn't mean his consciousness left his body. It might mean consciousness and sensory perception have properties under extreme stress we haven't mapped yet.
Saying we haven't mapped it yet is doing a lot of heavy lifting. If he saw something he couldn't see with his eyes, he was seeing with something else.
Perhaps. But look at what Sarah tries to paint later in the book. She calls it the color between. She tries to paint the space between the known colors. That is what the tattoo represents. It's not the abandonment of science, it's the indication that our instruments are calibrated for the wrong frequency. We must remain in the gap, uncomfortable as it is, without rushing to label it a soul.
But the gap itself implies there is a there. You don't have a gap between two things unless both things exist. The monitor is true, he was dead. The field is true, he was there. The book asserts that the most profound truth is that no framework can hold both truths simultaneously, yet they coexist anyway.
And that is exactly where I think the book lands ultimately. It is a story about how humans cope with the unexplainable. Whether the light is a metabolic flare or a doorway is almost irrelevant to the outcome. The result is Michael has to go back and be a better husband. James has to live without his church. Sarah has to live with the memory of sight. We must live here, in the biological world. The map of the brain is incomplete, certainly, but it is still the only map we have.
I see it differently. I think the convergence of these accounts across cultures, beliefs, and physical abilities points to a territory that exists prior to our biological existence. The wound that Sarah carries, that Danny carries, it's not just trauma. It's evidence of having touched something larger than the brain can hold. The book suggests the monitor captures the data, but the field captures the reality.
But we cannot verify the field. We can only verify the monitor.
Except for the photograph indicator, except for the tattoo, those are the verifications. They are the breadcrumbs leading out of the cave.
Or they are the anomalies that keep us searching.
And perhaps that is the point. The book leaves us with the running file. Dr. Adeyemi and Dr. Vasquez continue to collect the cases. They don't have a final theory. They have a sentence with a blank line at the end.
These people accessed something real.
Exactly. And the cursor is blinking.
And that is where we as readers and as thinkers have to sit. We want the answer. We want to know if it's biology or theology. But the space between refuses to give us the comfort of a single answer. It demands we live in the uncertainty.
The most profound assertion of the book is that the monitor and the field are both true, even if they contradict. The value lies in that space between them.
The room where we must learn to live with the questions.
That brings us to the end of our analysis of The Space Between. It's a book that challenges the boundaries of perception and faith and asks us what we do when our maps run out of road.
It's a fascinating, rigorous look at the edges of human experience. Whether you believe in the metabolic flare or the navigable territory, the data demands attention.
Thank you for listening to The Debate. We'll see you next time.